2024, an election year like no other. From the candidates to the issues, from voter integrity and analysis, we'll discuss debates, trends, patterns, election laws, and more. This is Vote 2024, Path to the Polls.
The race to determine who will be Donald Trump's running mate heats up. The former president says he's got sort of a pretty good idea who he'll choose. Well, the actual choice remains a mystery. Some insiders say a Rust Belt Republican is the best choice. They believe Ohio Senator JD Vance may be the one to flip Biden votes in key battleground states. That includes the Rust Belt, where if President Biden is going to win a second term, he needs to win voter support. But what about Florida Senator Marco Rubio? Interesting question here. Can he be the VP choice? Can he and Trump run on the same ticket? 12th Amendment may prove to be a headache when it comes to a Trump-Rubio ticket. Also, some interesting results involving the latest polling in Florida's Senate race. It appears the Democratic challenger, Debbie Mucarsel-Powell, is giving incumbent Senator Rick Scott a run for his money. She maintains Scott is vulnerable and paints him as the poster child of extremism. How vulnerable is the incumbent? And we'll take a look at the upcoming Biden-Trump debate. Attempts are being made to keep things civil. Will they be enough to keep things from happening like 4 years ago, when then President Trump repeatedly interrupted Biden, and when President Biden retorted, "Will you shut up, man?" Only time will tell. I'm Bruce Hamilton. Welcome to Path to the Polls. Joining me, political analyst Daniel Cronrath. Morning.
Hi, Bruce. Thanks for having me.
Good to have you here. So let's start with a couple of possible running mates for Donald Trump in his effort to return to the White House. Now, I mentioned he says he's got a pretty good idea who he wants. So do some insiders. They believe it's going to be Ohio Senator JD Vance. They think he can flip working-class voters in Rust Belt states, Biden country. Now, I know that Vance before had said some pretty nasty things about Donald Trump. He's since recanted. What do you think?
Well, I think one thing that Senator Vance has going for him is that he does embody this kind of right-wing populism or Republican populism, which is very, very popular with the Trump base. Okay, he says a lot of things which really track with a lot of Donald Trump's voters. But I think the other thing too, you mentioned being a Rust Belt senator. Ohio is already a state that if Donald Trump does not win, his election is in peril, okay? You got to look at the recent results. Ohio has been trending, whereas Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin still tend to be very much swing states. Ohio is becoming really very much a red state, which only outside of, say, Senator Sherrod Brown, who's a pro-labor Democrat, really the entire state right now is being controlled by the Republican Party. So you have to ask yourself, what kind of ability would Vance have to really impact Rust Belt voters outside of his own state of Ohio? Okay. For my calculation, the one thing individuals always say, well, what is the motivating factor behind a president of the United States choosing their vice president? There is only one. It's not their ability to lead. It's not their ability to take over the country if something happens to that president. It's to help them get elected. So if I'm Donald Trump, if I'm part of his team, I'm saying, okay, Florida. If we can't win Florida, then our campaign has a lot greater problems. So when you bring up Senator Rubio, for example, or you bring up somebody who's from a typical Republican state, which is already a Republican stronghold, that may not be to the best advantage of Donald Trump if he's really trying to reach in and win a state that he previously was unable to win.
You don't think he'll have appeal in Wisconsin and in Michigan and some other places? Because his ideology certainly plays there.
Yeah, but the problem is that that's already Trump's, ideology. You know, Trump is very, very nimble when it comes to his ideology too. We know this. I mean, you could say this is a failure of the candidate. You could say that this is what makes him popular with some individuals. But Trump is he's nimble. He can pivot on a dime to what he sees as being the most popular issue of the day. Okay, I think for a lot of people, Vance would be a choice that would make sense for Trump, even though he has disagreed in the past. We need to remember, even though Donald Trump is very much out there, he's also capable of forgiving people, you know, especially if it's politically convenient of him to move on and forget. He's capable of doing that. So, again, at the end of the day, another candidate I heard mentioned that we hadn't previously talked about was Doug Burgum, a Republican, a wealthy billionaire who some theorize that maybe just because he has access to hundreds of millions of dollars that would appeal to Donald Trump, because he can help self-fund his campaign to be vice president. And then the last thing is we need to remember this as well, is that Donald Trump had previously indicated he wanted to have a woman as his vice president. He made public statements. constituents. And of course, there's a short list of individuals who could still, Kristi Noem probably removing herself from that list with her illy timed book about shooting her dog. But,
she hasn't been vetted either, apparently.
No, she has not. But Congressman Stefanik is somebody else who's very much been in his course. And there are other Republican women out there who could be somebody that he would look to. But again, what at the end of the day do they bring to the ticket? Does Donald Trump even really need help with women voters in the United States? I mean, remember back in 2016, he won a majority of female voters in the United States. So maybe that even as a demographic isn't something. Lastly, will Donald Trump just pick somebody because Donald Trump likes that individual? I think another person that we had mentioned who's kind of fallen off the radar was South Carolina Senator Tim Scott. African-American, helping shore up that voting group, which has been widely reported. Donald Trump is performing better in polls with black voters than any Republican candidate in recent history. 25%. It's left a lot of Democratic pundits really scratching their heads. Why is this happening? How can the coalition stay together if President Biden loses this really key constituency for the Democratic vote?
And he is, if you look at the recent polling.
He is. So does Senator Scott, a capable legislator, a guy who ran for president before, a guy who's always been very respectful of Donald Trump, even when they were opponents. Is that somebody that he could potentially tap to help even further woo what was, again, a critically important constituency for the Democratic Party?
So let me go back to the import of Florida. We talked about this before. If Biden wants to win, he needs Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Trump won them in 2016, the so-called blue wall for Hillary Clinton. But Biden won it in 2020. They are center stage this year. Vance capably handles hostile media interviews. He shares an authentic connection with blue-collar workers, union-friendly, former Marine, big strengths. But on the flip side, his anti-big business inclinations might be a problem for Trump.
Well, and this is that populism that we're talking about. JD Vance is a Republican's Republican, no question about it. But he does have an organic way that he connects with voters who are blue collar, voters who tend to be less educated, which, by the way, this is becoming the new coalition of the Republican Party. A lot of union working class families now are finding the Republican Party because they feel when it comes to things that we've talked about in previous broadcasts, providing for material needs, opposition to what they see as the woke agenda in the United States right now, with things moving too fast for their social comforts. Somebody like a JD Vance can come in and really be appealing to that constituency. Again, former military experience, a guy, JD Vance, to your credit in pointing this out, I've never seen JD Vance run from an interview from anyone. He's capable of doing conservative television, liberal television. He's very popular on social media outlets as well. He's not afraid to deal with bloggers and YouTube show hosts. He's very approachable. So he does have an appeal, but then here again, how much will Donald Trump want to be upstaged potentially by his vice president of the United States? And that's another consideration to me.
It's interesting that you say that, because I just heard an interview where they say, Donald Trump's, if nothing else, wants to be a star. He wants to be the center focus. He wants to be in the spotlight. So he wouldn't want to be upstaged.
And there's good reason for that too, Bruce, because it works for Donald Trump.
Right.
I mean, we've talked about this before. If you like Trump, you don't like Trump. For a percentage of this population, he has a charisma which you can't teach. He's that kind of, he understands his own brand. He understands how to project that brand. So in Donald Trump's mind, anyone who undermines that is already potentially undermining a strategy which has worked for Donald Trump.
And that explains his popularity, too.
Sure.
There's no doubt. We talked a little bit about Florida's import here, so let's talk about Florida's Marco Rubio, another name prominently mentioned as a running mate. Florida, while not a swing state, is key here, but there may be a problem. Trump's a Florida resident. Rubio's a Florida resident. The problem is the 12th Amendment. You go, what? Well, it maintains that presidential and vice presidential candidates running on the same ticket, quote, shall not be an inhabitant of the same state with themselves. And theoretically, Florida electors would be blocked from voting for a Trump-Rubio ticket. Could be a complication, but there are loopholes. So let's look at history. 2000, Dick Cheney changed his residence from Texas to Wyoming so that he could run on the same ticket as Governor George W. Bush. So with Florida being so important, and if Trump wants to go that route, there are ways around it.
Yeah, there are. And we need to.
Well, I don't know who would change their residency. Trump wouldn't go to New York.
No.
Rubio wouldn't go somewhere else, but, you know.
I mean, to be honest, it would be Rubio. I mean, Donald Trump moved to Florida essentially because it's a tax haven for his wealth. I mean, that's one of the reasons he came here to begin with.
And where's Rubio going to go?
Yeah, where would he go? I think, first of all, you mentioned the 12th Amendment to the Constitution. This actually goes back to the original Constitution as well. If we remember, it used to be in the United States that the members of the Electoral College actually got to choose two candidates, okay, for President of the United States. And the person who came in second was the individual who became vice president. Okay, part of this was what we called this. It was called the trying to prevent what we call favorite sons, where one state could actually dominate a presidential election cycle by putting up two members from the same state. Okay, that was retained in the 12th Amendment of the Constitution, which is very specific. As a matter of fact, I think that the passage that you provided was in the first two sentences of the 12th Amendment, making it very, very certain that there would be equal representation and that no one state could dominate this. Could Rubio move? Of course he could move. Donald Trump could move. I mean, both of them have means. Right. They could go to any state they do.
But is it practical? No.
Well, as a practical matter as well, is what happens with Rubio then if he chooses to do this? How would he remain in the United States Senate if he's no longer living in the state which he represents in the Senate, which is another complicating factor for Senator Rubio. I think the other thing that we need to look to, Senator Rubio very, very clearly already in my mind is looking at 2028 for his own presidential run. How would serving Donald Trump, perhaps even resigning from the Senate, being a robust advocate for Donald Trump, how would that potentially impact his potential political future? And, you know, we kind of need to look at his vice presidential, going back, his vice presidential picks in the same way. Certainly Rubio. Certainly Tim Scott, a young politician relative to today's politics. Nikki Haley will definitely be back on the scene. JD Vance himself may choose to run in 2028. It's going to be a wide field. So I think that those individuals who are really looking to position themselves for president are also really going to be very, very careful in how they position themselves with Donald Trump.
Also don't want to upset the balance of power.
For sure.
Because that's going to be a consideration too.
For sure.
All right, so coming up, we go from the presidential race to Florida's hotly contested Senate race and someone who wants to unseat a man she calls the poster child of extremism, Rick Scott. That and more when Path to the Polls continues.
Wiles legacy.
All right, turn our focus to Florida's Senate race. Incumbent Rick Scott wasn't necessarily expecting any tough competition. And you know he wants Mitch McConnell's job in the Senate as well. Well, if you hear his Democratic opponent here in Florida tell the story, Debbie Mercasell-Powell, she's giving him a run for his money. And the latest FAU poll may bear that out if you believe polls. The former U.S. representative is just 2 points behind Scott among likely voters, 45% to 43%. Among all voters, the spread is 4 points at 44% for Scott to 40% for Mercasell-Powell. She's been gaining in the race, virtually unknown before. Might it be close in November? Now, I do have to point out that in the previous poll, she was a 16-point underdog, Daniel. Now, I do say that we've got to take any polls with a grain of salt.
Yeah, and I think if you look at the overall body of the polling work which has been done, and you see Rick Scott in most of these polls with a double-digit lead over an opponent that many Floridians are not familiar with. Yes, she's a former member of Congress, and yes, she's well-known in her own congressional district. But as you project that out to Jacksonville and through the Panhandle, she's basically largely an unknown. Nobody really knows who she is. So you're really talking about, in some ways, until she can define herself which obviously fundraising, things along those lines, how much money is she going to be able to get out and generate ads? I think it's really going to be an uphill struggle against a very, very well-funded. Last name has been on ballots now in Florida for what, the last 15 years, Bruce, as our governor and as a U.S. senator. Rick Scott's a very polarizing individual. If you are somebody who...
Oh, there's no doubt. His politics are polarizing.
Yeah, his positions are, you can see why why he's a candidate for Republican leadership. He's very consistently on message with everything that a typical Republican would identify with. The national debt, deficit, austerity measures, finding ways to privatize Social Security and other things to help save these programs. Now, we don't necessarily need to agree with this ideologically, but they're very, very popular with the Republican constituency. So the other thing we need to do is we need to, to the Senate race, we need to look at the top of the ticket. Okay, what's going to be going on with Biden and Trump? Young people are a core coalition of the Democratic Party for somebody like Powell to potentially get elected. Will their vote turnout be repressed because of what potentially is going on in Gaza, what's going on in the West Bank, what's going on in the Middle East? We know younger voters 18 to 30 are very disappointed with the way that President Biden has been handling that conflict. They're very disappointed with seeing things like Prime Minister Netanyahu coming to the United States to address Congress. What will President Biden say to that? What will Democrats in Congress do to say that?
Well, will the Democrats show up in Congress when Netanyahu addresses Congress?
Will there be organized rallies? And I say this not necessarily from a policy or depending upon what you feel about the conflict in the Middle East or in the entire region, but specifically how it will impact the senatorial race here in Florida. What will that look like? From my own standpoint, I think she's a good-looking candidate. I think she's running out of time, really, to introduce herself to the electorate. Mm-hmm. And again, at the end of the day, will she be able to have the money and will she be able to have the platform to get that done? Lastly, what will the ballot initiatives that everybody who is in the group of students that, as a college professor and dealing a lot with 18 to 30-year-olds, what kind of impact will those down ballot amendments have on this race? Legalizing cannabis. In the Florida Constitution, giving a woman the right to have an abortion prior to viability. Okay, these are going to be the big issues at the bottom of the ballot. That even potentially, if you were somebody who was turned off by Biden, will you come in line and will you fall in line and vote for the Democratic ticket, which would include Congresswoman Powell in that calculation? We'll just have to see.
Right, and the days of just pulling the lever for one party ticket, they're long gone, especially among the younger voters who are going to have so much more sway than they used to. So Florida Republicans are dismissing the poll as an outlier, saying other polling has Scott up by 12, as you mentioned. Now, we know the polls aren't necessarily reliable, so what do you go on here is basically what we've got to say.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, and for individuals who are like, well, there are still individuals out there, there's going to be 20% of the Republican coalition who will only vote for a Republican. There's going to be 20% of Democrats who would never consider. Well, first of all, that leaves you 60%, which includes 4 million registered NPAs in the state of Florida. So to your point, they will, even if they're more ideologically conservative or if they become an NPA because they've developed a distaste for the Democratic Party, whatever that calculation is, they will be looking at each race and they're going to be looking at the ballot amendments individually. They're not going to just be going in, and this isn't the days, in some states where they still have like the party line vote, Bruce. I remember we talked about Pennsylvania. Yeah. You remember in Pennsylvania, you used to be able to go in and just hit a switch for every Republican and it would autofill the entire ballot. So you could have 4 pages of candidates and you'd be done voting in 2 seconds. Those days are gone. We don't have that type of ballot system here in Florida, but also voters are looking at each one of these issues individually.
I've got to ask you, if he is reelected, do you think Scott has a chance of getting Mitch McConnell's job?
Sure. Why not? I mean, honestly, he's got time in the chamber. Rick Scott's somebody who does television interviews well. He's very, very well prepared. He's always on point. Where Senator Scott tends to struggle is when you do give him questions which are outside of the frame in which he's expecting them. Sometimes he's not as naturally gifted as a politician in that regard to say, and by the way, we're talking about the upper level of American politics now. You're talking about being able to take a question from left field on the fly and what do you do with it. He's better than many, worse than some. But I think that when you're talking about the leadership in the Senate, you have to be looking at, can this guy get things done? I think Scott has. I think he's got the credentials from being from a large state. There's going to be other individuals there who are going to be coming into play as well. But I think Rick Scott is as well positioned as any senator to take over the mantle in the Republican Senate.
Fair enough. Let's talk about the Supreme Court. What is up with Justice Samuel Alito? Remarkable shift. Legal analysts were stunned when Alito sided with the 8 others on the High Court bench in a unanimous decision in the high-profile case regarding the widely used abortion medication mifepristone. Is he feeling pressure because of questions concerning ethical issues? And I'm talking about when he blamed his wife for flying the flag upside down at his house.
Yeah, for me, again, and this is a question better left to say to WJXT Rick Mullaney, contributor, because Rick's an attorney as well. For me, I think this was just an issue of standing. I think that all the justices were able to look at this, and in order to bring a case to the Supreme Court of the United States, you have to be a party who can demonstrate that you have standing, that somehow you have been wronged. And the plaintiffs in this case could not demonstrate that. They were really bringing this as an ideological complaint. If there were an individual in this case were to come back through, it would be very interesting to see how their decision would change if you could actually find a plaintiff who said, this, what the FDA is trying to do, has actually harmed me in some way. I have standing. I can bring this through a lower district court. Let it wind its way through the court system. As it was, that is my understanding of this case, is that because they couldn't say that the plaintiff in this case had actually been impacted or harmed by FDA policy in any way, that they essentially just said there's no standing here, and that's why they were able to come to that unanimous conclusion.
All right, but let's take that particular ruling out of the equation.
Yeah.
There are a couple of days he just hasn't shown up at the court. There are those who think he's feeling some pressure.
Yeah, he very well could be. Again, Supreme Court justices, they set their own code of ethics. We've seen this relative to Clarence Thomas before, taking large gifts and just to speak plainly, kind of shamelessly, just not really caring. I mean, and maybe that's where in the contrast lies. Clarence Thomas really didn't change his behavior in any certain way, and Alito has. To your point, I mean, basically he's MIA from the job now. I'm sure that in his social circles, it could be argued also too when you think about what he said about this situation with flying the flag upside down. His wife was really the political activist here, very much like Jenny Thomas was the political activist. If you'll remember the January 6th, she was very, very much out there trying to find a way to overturn the results of the election prior to January 6th, while her husband Clarence Thomas was sitting on the Supreme Court. So, it brings into a larger, if you are the spouse of a Supreme Court justice, do you basically have to sit on the sidelines politically because you don't want to, endanger the reputation of your husband or your wife or whomever it is that you're in a relationship with who's on the court? Some would argue that Jenny Thomas and Alito's wife, that they have the ability to exercise their own constitutional freedoms if they so choose. But man, it puts when you're talking about the Supreme Court of the United States, a body which is supposed to be looking at the Constitution and interpreting the Constitution based upon what they believe the framers of this nation wanted, and to remove politics from that, it really is it's a terrible look. It's something which is deeply polarizing. And I think the other thing which is really interesting is that a lot of individuals, especially in liberal Democratic circles, were very concerned about, say, the appointments of Gorsuch and Comey Barrett and Kavanaugh, and they were concerned these were going to be radical Trump judges. Look who the misbehavior has been coming from, though.
Right.
It's been the ones who have been on the court very long time. The Bush appointees who have been doing this. While at least publicly, Comey Barrett and Gorsuch.
Comey Barrett's been a surprise.
She's really been a surprise. I think that despite the fact that she's very, very conservative and would disagree with a lot of people who are on the left, so far, at least in my mind, she's carried out everything that she's done has been very, very principled. It's been very, very much a, yes, this is my ideology, my ideology, but I'm not going to get involved in playing the partisan game that Alito and Thomas and essentially living in this culture of graft. Really, if you think about this just conversationally, the idea of Supreme Court justices getting this involved in contemporary politics, with Thomas taking millions of dollars of gifts and travel, it would really be the kind of thing that you would think in the past, Bruce, 20, 30, 40 years ago, this would force them to resign. And today there just doesn't seem to be that level of awareness. They're not responding to it.
You would think that they would have a conscience, but
you would think.
You would think. I'm not going to advocate controlling someone's wife, but you would also think they'd be mindful of the fact that their husbands, their spouse, has a certain position of power, and you respect.
Yes.
What goes along with that position of power?
Well, and let's be clear about this. For example, we know Kamala Harris's husband is very, very much involved with anti-Semitism projects, and we know that a lot of first ladies have always had their advocacy issues, from Laura.
A cause to let.
That's right, from Laura Bush with literacy. All the way back to Lady Bird Johnson with Keep America Beautiful, to Michelle Obama with fitness, and so they all have had their own political agenda. But what makes this unique is the fact that we're talking about the Supreme Court, and these are individuals who are not supposed to be involved in policy. They're not supposed to be involved in making policy. They are literally there to use their assumed power of judicial review, determine what laws are constitutional, and to determine what parties have been aggrieved by the legal system. That is their role, okay? So for them to step outside of that and to show themselves vulnerable to corporate influence should really, regardless if we're on our left or right, and I would tell my conservative friends, and I talk to them all the time, this should be concerning behavior. Even if you happen to like the way they vote, as a citizen, this should be concerning behavior.
All right, let's turn our attention to the upcoming debates, which is this Thursday. So CNN has some rules that are in place. And let's go back to 2020. It was openly hostile. They do not want to have a repeat of that. So the rules that they have in place, let's talk about them. They flipped a coin, all right? So we know that President Biden is going to be the right. We know that former President Trump gets the last word. They are going to mute mics, no studio audience, no pre-written notes, no props, 2 minutes for answers, 2 minutes for rebuttals, 1 minute response to rebuttals. Is that going to be enough to keep things civil with these two?
Oh, I can't imagine. I don't. I mean, it's really kind of an impossible task. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, the CNN anchor, the main guy who does the evening news, now his name's escaping me. He's going to be moderating the debate.
Yeah, now I'm having
Jake Tapper.
Jake Tapper. And Dana Bash.
Yeah, and Dana Bash. And those two are going to be moderating the debate. You know, I don't know how you contain Donald Trump. I think that Joe Biden comes from an era of being in politics for 50 years where he kind of has a more of a statesmanship element. I think that Biden would very much like to keep this debate.
Well, Biden did say, won't you shut up, man?
Yeah, well, yeah, because he wouldn't, you know.
Right.
Yeah, but, you know, Trump's the wild card here. I mean, he really is. What I would envision is a lot of non-policy specifics. I would envision Trump's pathway to success will be making fun of CNN itself. Okay, that's one of the biggest things.
Because they're not Fox.
They're not Fox, but still making fun of the media is very popular in American politics right now. Sorry to say, not you, Bruce, but but you understand. I mean, the media becomes.
I take my hits.
The media becomes an easy punching bag for their coverage or lack thereof. The way they set the agenda, the way they determine how to frame stories about Trump, and his supporters back since he first started running in 2015 have always really gravitated towards the way that Donald Trump throws the news media under the bus. Okay, I mean, this goes all the way back to the Megyn Kelly interview when he was on Fox, even during that debate. So that's always been something which works. I consider him doing that. You know, what Trump has in the way of policy specifics, I think considering the fact that Biden, despite the fact that a lot of people, you know, consider Biden too old for the job now to be, you know, or
one's 81, the other's 78. So
I think that Biden will come into this debate better prepared, in a classic way, betterly prepared.
Well, he's spending his time at Camp David being prepared. Donald Trump is spending his time on the campaign trail.
Right, and I think you're going to hear Biden try to talk about things that he wants to talk about. You know, a Dow which is at record highs, unemployment which is at historic lows, inflation finally creeping down after the supply chain shocks and the pandemic and all of the things which jacked up the cost of consumer goods. I think you're going to hear him talk about that. I think you're going to hear him talk about it a lot. And then I think you're going to hear Trump interrupt him a lot. And I think you're going to hear Trump say things like, well, everybody out there feels and knows the economy was better when my president and you've ruined it. Everybody out there knows that America was safer when I was trying to build the wall. You've ruined it. Okay? And I think that that's going to be, and by the way, for a lot of Trump supporters, that's going to play better than statistics. Because I think at the end of the day, and this is where Biden, we've discussed this before, this is where Joe Biden really needs to roll back the clock and try to connect with people. He's got to be the Joe Biden that demonstrates empathy. He's got to be the Joe Biden that while he's saying unemployment's low, I know you are still hurting. I am trying to do what I can do. Because Donald Trump, he does that organically. People identify with him. They believe, whether Trump has a real solution to this, a real policy solution or not, he does a better job of connecting with the audience. But at the end of the day, man, there used to be a saying, you know, when you had a big debate like this, you would try to figure out what your drinking game was going to be. You know, every time that one of the candidates does this, you know, you have a sip or you have a shot of something. You know, for Trump, I think it's going to be, you know, how often does he interrupt? Which maybe in the first 10 minutes would not be good for anyone's health if they're watching that debate and participating in the game. And then for Biden, you know, I think the biggest thing is, can he stay consistent? Will he have lapses? Like even in what most people agreed was a promising and a good State of the Union address by President Biden, towards the end of that State of the Union address, you could hear his voice tail off. You could hear a lot of the things that he was saying. A lot of his affect was starting to fade. Because again, you know,
can he sustain?
Yeah, when your next birthday is 82 years old and you're in prime time later in the evening and you have a grueling schedule, which he does as President of the United States to this day, you know, will he be able to stay alert enough? The one advantage he's going to have is that sparring with Donald Trump may just keep him awake and may keep him lively enough to do it.
And sadly, I don't want the news coverage to denigrate to the zingers and the one-liners and things like that. I want it to be on whatever substance may come out of this debate, and hopefully there will be substance. And I don't want to see it to denigrate to, you know, attacks on convictions, Hunter Biden and things like that, because That's not what the American public wants to hear. That's not what the American public cares about.
Yeah, I shared this with you off camera. I spent 8 days over in the UK last week, and I was talking a lot about politics, both at the university level and then just at the street level with common people. And people in England really have no idea. They are so befuddled that once again we are running these two people in 2024. They're like, how is American politics, in a country of 330 million people, how are you taking these two individuals who were unpopular the first time and running them again 4 years later? And I'm sitting here as a political analyst, and I'm like, I don't have a good answer for that. Outside of the fact that they're very, very popular within both of their political parties, they've both before demonstrated the ability to win, even though Donald Trump lost the last time. We're going to continue to put these two candidates out there. And a lot of the curiosity was really with the Democrats. As I was talking to people who were really involved with the Labor Party movement in the UK, which is their version of our Democratic Party, they're like, didn't Joe Biden say he was only going to run one term? Like, why is he running again? Where's the bench for the Democratic Party in the United States? And I think there is a bench for the Democratic Party. There are definitely younger Democrats who would love to run. Cory Booker, Gavin Newsom. I mean, the list. Kamala Harris herself. I mean, the list goes on and on. But it's really, really hard when you try to have a unified approach to tell Joe Biden, if he doesn't want to get out of the way, to get out of the way. That's very, very difficult.
It is very difficult, and we don't have the answer as to why he's running again. We don't have the answer as to why Donald Trump is running on behalf of the Republican. We do have the answer. Yeah. I can't say it here because I'll be attacked for it. Yeah. But there are alternatives. There are younger alternatives. And I can tell you, people sit back and they say to me, why are you reporting on, the trials and this and that? Because people care about the issues. We do report about the issues. But the problem is that people don't listen to those things. Mm-hmm. But we understand in the media what's important. And I hope that the media understands that substantively, people want to hear what they have to say about the issues. They want to hear that Joe Biden needs to understand that they're hurting at the grocery store, they're hurting at the gas pump, and things like that. And they want to hear the same from Donald Trump. What are you going to do about the economy and things like that? Mm-hmm. And these personal attacks really have no place. Yeah,
the ad hominem attacks are bad. And, in episodes we've done in the past when I've shared and brought on several of my students to talk to you about issues important to them, for individuals under 25. You're right, we have to cover these trials, Bruce, because they're historic. We're talking about a former president of the United States. You would be performing journalistic malfeasance if you didn't cover these issues, mm-hmm. Okay, because it's the president of the United States. But still, is that the real motivating factor for people who are going to be going to the polls? And you've just said it. The fact that inflation is creeping down now, that doesn't reset the clock on how much it spiked over the last 2 years.
Right.
When you're looking at core products like oatmeal and eggs and things which have not come down to a level, and then you're trying to look at rents and the affordable housing issue here in Jacksonville, which is critical and impacts people from 18 to 80 when you're talking about non-homeowners or property insurance for homeowners. These are really, really important issues which really bring people to the polls and activate them. But at the same time, man, you can't not cover a former president of the United States on trial. Right. You just can't do it.
It's interesting because Christy and I went out to dinner the other night, and I was talking to a friend of mine, and I'll tell you just flat out, he was wearing a MAGA Trump hat, and we started talking about some of the issues and things, and he said, oh, you know what, philosophically, we don't disagree as much as I thought. And I said, you've got to understand that when you start talking about issues and things, it's a whole different ballgame. Mm-hmm. Don't look at the veneer. Don't look at things broad-based. The world isn't black and white.
Yeah.
And then when you do that, it's a whole different ballgame.
Well, think about this for a second. Think about one of the things that Donald Trump said policy-wise back when he ran in 2016 is that he wanted to repatriate American jobs. He wanted to start making things in the United States again. He wanted to keep industries here, and he wanted to keep people to work. Now, Bruce, for my entire lifetime, that is a core Democratic value and message, creating strong labor jobs, strong working-class jobs, that if you want to work with your hands, that you can feed a family, buy a house, and have cars. That's a core Democratic value. It's shifted, and we've gotten away from that. But when you talk about the appeal of Trump, when you just get away from Trump, there are a lot of people who have isolationist tendencies. Yeah. They don't know why we're not taking care of people at home, but we're giving billions of dollars to Ukraine and Israel and Taiwan. We can make a case all day long about foreign policy and have a whole discussion about that. But for a lot of people, that just doesn't jive for them.
Right. They don't. And those labels don't mean what they used to.
No, they don't.
People don't get it.
No.
And on that note, thanks for watching Past at the Polls. We'll have so much more to discuss after the debate and on future episodes of Past the Polls. Thanks as always for being here.
Thanks, man.
Appreciate you. And thank you for watching. If you want to revisit this episode, there is an encore performance at 7 o'clock, and you can watch on demand on news4jax.com and News4Jax Plus.
See why every day more people are choosing News4Jax, Northeast Florida and South Georgia's #1 source for local news.